Доброе утро. What a pleasure it is to speak to you in central Moscow at the 10th, the X HSE Higher Education Conference, the X Conference. We are the X Conference. We are the X people. I want to begin by thanking those at HSE who have made happen our international project on the contributions of higher education, and especially Isaac Froman, who conceived the project, and I think in consultation with Dr. Kuzmanov, whose commitment to international cooperation sustains many projects and research outputs alongside Maria. Also Daria Platonova, our very capable administrative backbone in our project, Nastya and Anna. The team in the Russian project also, which is very promising with its work on regional contribution of higher education. And I want to thank all the international colleagues for the great discussion we had at the project meeting yesterday. I need this. How are we going?
Yeah, it's coming.
Now, the X Conference brings you, a much larger group of talented scholars and future leaders, into this discussion of the contributions of higher education. So what are the contributions of higher education? What does it do in society, economy, region, nation, world? Are these contributions different from town to town and from nation to nation? Do they vary between the fields of knowledge and the occupational training we provide? How can we observe and measure these contributions? What is their value? Who decides what they should be? And who decides what their value is? These are important questions, among the biggest questions in higher education policy and research. This morning, I will cover 3 areas. First, I provide a summary of the contributions of higher education, which I will call CHE, in 4 domains. Second, I discuss the limitations of 3 existing ideas about CHE, which limit our ability to improve these contributions. The idea that all value in higher education is defined by an economic market, the idea that all value is defined by the state, and the idea that in higher education all that matters is world-class universities. Third, I argue that the CHE and concepts of measures of CHE vary between countries. Russia needs to find its own path to the CHE. And then I conclude with those CHE that are common to higher education everywhere. And this is where I really need the slides. You will need the slide for the next bit, I'm afraid, so I'm trying. Higher education is moving towards the high participation systems era, with more than half of the world's 18-year-olds enrolled in post-school education. The world gross tertiary enrollment ratio is already at 40%. Really need the slide. More than 60 countries have their own science systems and prepare their own doctoral students. Higher education is contributing to societies, economies, and political systems and culture on a scale that we've never seen before. I will wait now. I'm afraid I can't do without this next slide.
Просим прощения, небольшие технические проблемы с загрузкой презентации. Минута буквально.
Okay, good. Well done. So this is what I'm covering today. And this is what I want to stay on screen until I move it. Now, higher education carries out many functions. It forms people, or rather, it helps people to form themselves. It's an agent of socialization. It teaches people to understand institutions and to relate to each other. Higher education also provides conditions for economic activity, not just qualifications, but graduates' information, skills, expertise, and their social networks. Higher education produces, organises, disseminates, and reproduces formal knowledge. It fosters criticism and civil discussion, and it furthers global cooperation. Now, how can we sort this complex set of contributions? Now, one of the great principles of social science is this: when in doubt, reach for a matrix. Take a look at it for a moment. Now, the figure arranges the contributions of higher education using two axes. One axis moves from left to right. It distinguishes goods or outcomes of higher education at national and local level from those that are at global level, or in the case of European Union, regional level. Now, the other axis moves from individualized outcomes at the top to collective or jointly consumed outcomes at the bottom. And so the matrix draws our attention to two aspects which are often neglected: collective contributions and global contributions. Mostly, we just focus on what's happening in the top left cell, which is the cell of individualized national and local goods. Now, let's start with those. The attributes acquired by local graduates. Many are open to empirical observation and measurement. Non-pecuniary returns to graduates include better health outcomes, capabilities in communication, greater political connectedness, greater levels of tolerance, and a sense of social responsibility. These qualities have been shown to correlate with higher education again and again in different country studies. The pecuniary returns include graduate social position and the most researched outcomes of higher education, which is the market value of graduates as human capital, measured by the net rates of return associated with investment in degrees based on lifetime earnings. Higher education does more for students and graduates than boost their earning power. It helps them to form themselves as people in many ways. It builds their capability, their free agency as reflective, self-managing individuals who are also social individuals. The immersion of students in knowledge and social values provides content for their freedom. This brings us to the great unresolved debate about the individual benefits of higher education, the human capital view versus the Bildung view. And I'll come back to this. Let's turn now to individualized global goods. These are the people formation effects that are associated with cross-border students and cross-border faculty. They include augmented skills, knowledge, and earnings, greater facility in languages and cultural diversity, which is personally enriching and often vocationally useful. Research on international students shows that prolonged mobility quickens personal flexibility in the face of difference and change, and heightens confidence, proactivity, and personal agency. The mobility experience for many people is empowering. Now let's move then to the third cell, which is in the bottom left, collective national and local goods. Higher education generates many collective goods at national and local level. These include the fostering of an advanced level of social and scientific literacy across the population, the reproduction of the professions and occupations, and the many contributions made by expert faculty to government policy and regulation. And that happens in every country. Among these collective goods are the contributions to society, economy, and cultural life in cities and towns and regions. One essential CHE is the structured set of opportunities to participate in higher education itself. The social equity of this contribution can be measured. For example, gender ratios in the disciplines, participation or completion in degree programs by social, ethnic, or rural and urban backgrounds. We can also measure opportunity in terms of access to elite universities. In many countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, China, and Russia, there are high participation systems which overall are socially inclusive, but where it's become harder for students from poor backgrounds to enter the top universities. This feeds the reproduction of social inequality. Among the collective global goods is the facilitation of people mobility through bilateral and multilateral cooperative agreements, such as Erasmus, and university partnerships, accreditation and recognition protocols, and so on. Even more important, perhaps, among the global goods are research and codified knowledge. International research collaboration sustains work on common global problems, such as climate change. Global cooperation is mostly driven not by governments or universities, but in bottom-up disciplinary exchanges. This constitutes an expanding global zone of free critical intellectual thought. So there's a brief summary of the contributions of higher education, but this is a catch-all description, not a set of categories we can use for analytical purposes. The categories are not tight, they overlap. They merely are pointers for the kind of research we may wish to pursue, empirical research in understanding the contributions better. I think the next steps are these. Firstly, we need a theory of the contributions that embeds higher education firmly in society and explains the inner and outer drivers of CHE. Second, we need to take account of the fact that in crucial ways, CHE vary between different countries and political cultures, and to distinguish those CHE that vary between countries from those that are common to all countries. Third, we need reliable measures of CHE, not just rates of return and data on social equity, but valid metrics for as many CHEs as possible, for monitoring progress over time and comparing one unit of higher education with another. And governments need those kinds of metrics to better guide their investment and their regulation of higher education. Now, this ambitious social science agenda faces a formidable obstacle. That is ideas about CHE that already exist, especially the dominant model in the ultra-market reading of neoclassical economics. Now, these ideas, in my view, are often wrong, but they have a strong hold on government policy and in the public mind. Challenging these ideas might seem like an uphill battle, but as Karl Popper said, it's as important to disprove a wrong idea as it is to advocate a right idea. So here goes. Now, to unpack the dominant economic model, I need to tell you a story to take you back to the roots of Western culture. Many different branches have grown from those roots. The ultra-market economic model of higher education in which private benefits are seen as opposed to public benefits, is only one branch. But you can only understand the problem in terms of these roots. Now, at the core of Western political culture, there are two assumptions. The first is the idea that the individual can be understood separately from society. Now, in reality, it's impossible to have individuals without society, and impossible to have society without individuals, as John Dewey pointed out. But in its ideal form, Western political thought imagines the individual at some moment as standing alone. Hence, methodological individualism is possible. The second assumption is that of division of powers. In the Western Republican tradition, which dates from the Dutch War of Independence against Spain, the Enlightenment, the French War of Independence, the French Revolution and the American War of Independence against Britain, in this Republican tradition, the state is a limited state. Society is separated into the state sphere, the market, and civil society. The Western state is not all-powerful. It does not include everything, and its boundary lines are always being contested. So the issue of university autonomy is always the hottest issue in higher education policy. Now, Western political systems are designed to limit the role of the state, to maximise the space for the individual and the market and civil society. And the individual has a special primacy. And here you can see the origins of student-centred learning and also the very different student as self-investor. The term public plays an important but ambiguous role in Western political cultures. In the Republican tradition, the word public can refer to the collective goods embodied in the state. It can refer to the civitas, or body of citizens, the democratic sphere, civil society outside the state, and sometimes it can refer to the open market. The term public is applied to higher education in three rather different ways. First, the sense I'm talking about in economics, where public and private are seen as zero-sum. More public, less private, more private, less public. They're seen as opposed to each other in some way. In this framework, higher education is either categorised as public or as private. The more higher education produces private goods for graduates, the less it must be a public good, and so on. Second, there is the sense of public, the term public, as an inclusive communication network, public opinion, public media, public campaign, or in Jürgen Habermas's term, public sphere. For example, the idea of the university as a public sphere, which was advanced by Craig Calhoun, as a zone of reasoned argument, constructive criticism of the state, contending values, and new democratic movements. Third, there is the more general term public good, kind of normative public good, meaning a universal container of all good things, the common welfare. You can't argue against the public good, can you? Now, neoclassical economics works with the first idea, in Samuelson's famous reading of it, where public and private are zero-sum in relation to each other. Now, let me emphasise this is one particular reading of the Western tradition. It's not the only possible reading. It's a particular high market reading. In this vision, the universe is divided into two halves: economic markets, an activity that ought to be in markets, but at this time it is not. Markets produce private goods. Markets are normal and public goods are the exception. Public goods cannot be produced profitably in a market because they are non-rivalrous or non-excludable. Goods are non-excludable when the benefits cannot be confined to single buyers, such as clean air regulation. Goods are non-rivalrous when they're consumed by any number of people without being depleted. Classically, the mathematical theorem, a global public good, always useful. Private goods are neither non-rivalrous nor non-excludable, and they can be produced and sold in markets. And it's only when market failure occurs, when it's not possible to produce them a good profitably in a market, that it's necessary for government to step in. So the classical economist says state intervention is needed in basic research because that's subject to market failure, but it's not necessarily needed in education because you can produce that on a market. Now, this approach fails to grasp that markets depend on the state and conditions established in social organisation and collective culture. And public and private goods in higher education, far from being opposed, are often interdependent and they often produce each other. For example, greater access for students, which is a collective public good, leads to more private benefits for graduates in labour markets. This drives enrolment growth and that enrolment growth adds ultimately to the number of persons with advanced literacy and lifts the level of social literacy as a whole. And that's a collective public good. And so on. So you get these constant feedback effects between private goods and public goods. And those feedback effects are hidden by a zero-sum approach, which is saying you have to choose it's private or it's public. Now, the other uses of public in the Western tradition, as a communicative network, as in public media or public sphere, and as universal welfare, public good, they're not so limiting. You can have those in conjunction with private goods as well. You could argue that the public good aggregates the private goods and provides conditions for private goods to be produced. But those uses of public don't have the same potency as the economic model has developed. The zero-sum definition of public and private is basically ideological. It automatically minimises the role of government, regardless of the often negative side effects when government evacuates the social realm. It treats public goods as a low-value residual category left in the shadows. If something isn't bought and sold in a market, it doesn't have real value that we can measure. Now, this includes the collective contributions of higher education and also those individual benefits that are not subject to market transactions, such as the broader formation of students that I mentioned earlier. So, enter human capital theory. Now, when developed in the 1960s, it was precisely designed to focus all attention on those CHE that are fixed with market prices and discard everything else. But it was also a brilliant economic abstraction. It provided a neat set of calculations that said something important, and it seemed to sum up in a very effective way the efficiency of production of higher education. In Gary Becker's foundational theory, education augments the marginal productivity of labour. Marginal productivity ought to attract, does attract, choose, higher earnings. The value of investment in education is defined by the lifetime earnings of the graduate. Education, work, productivity and earnings are in a neat linear continuum. When educated students acquire the embodied productivity, the portable human capital that's used by employers, then graduate earnings will follow. And if earnings are not flowing, either the labour market or the education market must be not working properly. Human capital theory provides the dominant policy narrative in Russia and many other countries. It has helped governments to shift the costs of higher education onto individuals and families. If the main benefits are seen as the benefits to individuals, the student should pay, not society. It also provides a system of public accountability. Institutions are officially judged by the average salary of their graduate earnings, as if higher education is the sole factor in shaping employability, and the effects of home and family and fluctuations in the labour market are irrelevant. The knowledge graduates acquire is scarcely discussed, except that STEM is seen as more valuable human capital. The psychological and ethical qualities of that higher education provides for graduates receive even less attention. So the rise of human capital theory to an exclusive role in defining higher education's contributions, rather than the more modest role it should have been given, has reduced what people see as the contributions of higher education. A narrow focus on individual benefits breeds a more selfish society. The use of rates of return to measure the value of higher education so that the more graduates earn above the mean, the better the institution is doing, has legitimated the rapid growth of inequality in many countries. This further immiserates those who do not enter higher education, who are already the casualties of the high participation era. And in its rise to the top in policy, human capital theory has partly displaced a much richer theory of student formation, the German idea of Bildung. Now, Bildung dates from Immanuel Kant and the German Enlightenment. It was taken up by Wilhelm von Humboldt in his prescription for the University of Berlin in 1810 that underpins the modern research university. And later, it heavily influenced the educational ideas of John Dewey in the United States, the most important, arguably the most important philosopher of education in history. Under Bildung, students are prepared as rational persons, immersed in knowledge for a life of self-learning. Ethical formation and social awareness are important. The conditions under which students learn are significant. Bildung requires freedoms to learn and to teach. Bildung is a preparation in free agency that's nested in society. Kant believed that when students are prepared in Bildung, as graduates, they will together create a continually improving society. This idea of Bildung as self-development resonates with Confucian practices of self-cultivation, which are much older and which still shape family and schooling in China today. In fact, you can trace the influences of Confucian thought in the 18th century German discussion of Bildung. There is no deeper process of education than that in East Asia. There is also a partial intersection between Bildung and the Soviet idea of higher education as the creator of a new kind of person, Soviet man, inverted commas, for a new society. However, Bildung does not foster an instrumental relationship with the labour market, and its classical exponents believe that education should prepare graduates as free, constructive critics of the state, not as cogs in a state machine. Now, a more modern version of Bildung, which I call higher education as self-formation, places greater emphasis on the self-reflective, autonomous learner. Higher education as self-formation refers to all the ways that students deliberately develop themselves by their own efforts in higher education. There are many ways in which students expand themselves. Some students love the subjects they study and find knowledge to be an end in itself, at least while they're at university. It changes them. It transforms their language and their perspective on the world, and those changes are often permanent. Some do invest in themselves as future human capital, calculating their lifetime earnings as human capital theory imagines. There's research evidence showing that a minority of students are doing what Gary Becker talked about. Many want to achieve a better social position after they graduate, and nearly all would like to hold a graduate job. Many are conscious of the need to at least hold or improve on the social position achieved by their parents. And some also want social capital, and they talk about that, or they want cultural capital. Some, of course, have a passion for the common good and want to make the world a better place and imagine themselves working in future on global problems. I'm sure there are many in this room who have those feelings. Some are looking for suitable marriage partners. Many are just finding themselves while they're moving fully into adult life. Now, all of these uses of higher education are valid personal choices and uses, and they do not exclude the economic returns or the social position argument. That's part of the self-formation process, along with all of the other ways in which students augment themselves. I agree with Amartya Sen's reading of this. I mean, he says we need human capital theory to explain one aspect of the contributions of higher education, an important aspect. But what matters most is human capability. So we need a theory of self-formation alongside human capital theory. But I would make the argument too that self-formation is a more accurate description, a more complete description of what students go through. It's a larger idea. it's more inclusive. Self-formation includes human capital formation, but human capital formation excludes most kinds of self-formation. So in a solely human capital world, higher education becomes smaller, more narrow and more selfish. The main CHE are simply the augmented earnings of individuals. But in self-formation, the CHE are multiple attributes and multiple forms of self-fulfillment, and they're also associated with the Kantian idea of a better society. The individual is more powerful through self-formation than through investment in human capital alone. Though human capital theory focuses on benefits for the individual, that individual is valued in external terms by labour market forces that are beyond her or his control. But the value of educated self-formation lies in the larger individual that is created, and only the individual can do the actual learning. Ultimately, the graduate determines the contributions of higher education. In that sense, you can argue that this more socially nested theory of students and self-formation better fulfills the Western ideal of focusing on the rights and needs of the individual. So that is the high capitalist version of CHE with its zero-sum public and private good, and the larger practice of self-formation and Bildung, which it tries to take out of sight. Now, against the determination to turn everything into economic value, some push back from the opposite direction. And instead of saying public bad, private good, they say public good, private bad. Their universe is divided between state and non-state. The state is seen as the source of all public good. State or non-state, it's another zero-sum game. These dualisms always end in tears. Now, in this framework, in a country with a long tradition of a powerful state like Russia, the state becomes the absolute master of all things in higher education and the source of all contributions that higher education makes, not higher education institutions and their people who are just talking dolls, puppets of the state. Now, this leads to the collapse of institutional autonomy, which is essential to high performance, and the academic freedom that's essential to consistently world-class research. It limits the contributions of higher education again, because higher education can only do what the state imagines it could do, and the state is not an expert on higher education. And history shows the folly of trusting the state to always get it right in higher education. Not to put too fine a point on it, from the Tsars to Stalin and to the post-Soviet time, the state in Russia has weighed heavily on people and institutions. Intellectual liberalism was the exception under the Tsars, not the rule. Under Stalinism, from the mid-1920s onwards, intellectual workers were repeatedly decimated. The post-Soviet 1990s saw the fire sale of state assets and the collapse of the public budgets that supported universities and vocational training and research institutes. The intelligentsia have not been allowed to recover their former position even. Russia's per capita income is half the West European level, and Moscow is more affluent than that. But many faculty in research universities are paid a quarter of what their counterparts receive in Western Europe. This drives much of the talent abroad. Yet in truth, the term public good has always been inadequate to describe the contributions of higher education in any society. To say higher education is a public good says nothing about its content or whether it's broadly available or improves people's lives. And the concept of the common good that UNESCO has developed addresses this weakness in the public good notion. The application of common good to education has become surprisingly widely discussed in a short time, which I think suggests that it does fill a gap. The common good, as UNESCO discusses it, lies in practices that contribute to shared social welfare and relations of solidarity, inclusion, tolerance, universal freedoms, equality, human rights, individual capability that's available on a democratic basis. In higher education, this means student formation that builds sociability and educational opportunity on an equal basis. The Nordic countries, which deeply value solidarity, pursue policies designed to secure common goods, such as free and universal access to high-quality courses. Note that such common goods can be produced by non-government institutions as well as by state sector institutions, and they're augmented in participatory communal action. These are goods not only of the state, but of civil society. The third idea, as it's currently being practiced anyway, that often limits the contributions of higher education is the world-class university idea. Everywhere, it seems, policymakers and public media want to lift the global standing of leading research universities, and that's understandable. WCUs are essential to all national science systems. They're especially important in emerging countries. We all need WCUs. Russia needs WCUs. And WCU policy does not have to have a downside. It is possible to run a system with WCUs and high quality in other institutions. I would instance the Netherlands or Finland as countries that essentially have achieved that. But in most countries at the moment, it does go wrong. WCU policy does go wrong. Building WCUs has become associated with an obsession with rank ordering, which drives down the status and the resources of higher education institutions that are not WCUs. The concentration on WCUs is lifting the CHE in the few and diminishing the CHE in the many. That's a serious problem we need to address, without abandoning the idea of research excellence and the concentration of science in particular institutions. So these are the ways in which the CHE can be diminished. High capitalist economics, zero-sum, over-centralisation in the state, and the WCU reputation race. I now pass to the third and final point in this paper, which is how CHE vary across the world. Intellectual and policy judgments about CHE vary according to national and local meanings of concepts like the public good or the common good, which have varied equivalents in different languages and in the political culture. And these differences are rooted in lexical and political cultural differences. You will recall the Western political imaginary I showed you before, with its large role for the individual, limited liberal state, separation of the market, and separation of civil society. Now, China's political imaginary is very different. In the classical Confucian tradition, society is imagined as interlocked circles. The outer circles have primacy over the inner circles. The individual is embedded in the family, the large family group, which in turn is embedded in the larger society, which is also, in some sense, the state. The state was not limited by markets and civil society in the Confucian vision, but had an overarching, comprehensive role. In the imperial time, though, the state did not reach much below the village level. Higher education in the Chinese tradition was always at the service of the state, training the meritocratic officials. Now, Chinese society has changed in the modern period. The state has become more powerful in people's lives. The individual has been partly disembedded from family and location amid the massive migration from the countryside to the growing cities. Footloose individuals have triggered stronger state controls. Meanwhile, higher education remains deeply embedded in nation-building agendas, although there's a higher degree of autonomy in the day-to-day operation of individual institutions. The student as consumer rhetoric, is also heard now in China because there are market forces at work. But this is a different relation between the state, the individual, and higher education to that found in the West or in Russia. So what then is the Russian political imaginary. Well, that's the $64,000 question, or should I say 64,000 ruble question. That's the question, isn't it? It's for you to determine it in the longer term, but it seems to me that Russia has been partly shaped by the Western Republican tradition. Russia, since Peter the Great, has been open to the West. Marxism is from the West. Yet Russia's always combined this Western influence with a centralising state, with a comprehensive scope for action, which is different to the post-revolutionary states of the 18th century in the United States and Europe. There is an ongoing civil society, most of the time in modern Russian history, that's partly independent of the state. I mean, in late Tsarist time, you saw this, perestroika brought it back quite quickly, which shows that it's deeply embedded in the culture. And of course, it's been part of the post-Soviet period as well. And in that respect, Russia is different to China, which only episodically seems to be able to bring forward a civil society, like in the 1980s, where there was a flourishing of a civil society for a period in China. And in Russia, I mean, sometimes intellectuals and artists have been allowed to flourish, but civil society is smaller and is less globalised than in Western Europe, much smaller than in the United States, whose great strength, I think, is its fecund civil society, its huge civil society. And Russian civil society often finds itself, like at present, embattled with the state. Russia needs its own model of contributions of higher education, and it's unwise to import American high market models. The CHE are different in Russia. I think they're more state organised, and they're more vocationally education-centred. And higher education is embedded in different local, regional and industry locations. The distributed and embedded system is an essential strength in Russia, which signifies that it probably would be unwise to put all of the eggs into the basket marked WCUs. The weakness of civil society is another national feature which higher education should take into account. This suggests a constructive role for higher education in helping to fill the partial void and in fostering civil organisation, almost as if in Habermas's public sphere. Internationalised universities like HSE secure greater autonomy, greater space to be themselves. But most institutions are not highly internationalised. There are many foreign students in Russia, but there are few foreign faculty, and many Russian doctoral students and faculty who go abroad do not return to energise their institutions with foreign ideas. This is different to China, where returning diaspora are one of the keys to the great positive transformation of universities in China. Russia has a high level of social participation in higher education. This is a significant achievement. Yet all the institutions arguably are underfunded. And competition in the WCU project are driving stratification and emptying out the value below the would-be WCUs. Tuition policy is an odd combination of Soviet-free places and a quasi-market that's focused on diplomas rather than on self-formation, on what is learned or how students are developing their capabilities. Those issues don't come into the market. This is the triumph of a shallow version of the human capital imaginary and the eclipse of Bildung in Russia. Individual and collective global goods are also underdeveloped. The weakness of civil society diminishes the potential contribution to social relations and cultural life. These are not just problems, these are opportunities. There is much scope to develop the CHE in Russia. A renovated national system would build on the strengths of Russian higher education in region building and in vocational education, and in the stellar achievements of the physical sciences and engineering. However, if this inevitably state reference system is to decisively lift its performance, it will need to find a way to normalise high levels of institutional autonomy. It is possible for higher education to be both a branch of state and operate with high autonomy. This was von Humboldt's formula in 1811 in Berlin, and something like this after Deng Xiaoping reforms, enabled China, science in China and higher education in China to really take off. High level of autonomy, but nested in the state. It is possible to achieve that. Finally, though I focused on differences between countries in the contributions of higher education, there are common elements across the world. Nation-building higher education is found everywhere, and questions of social access arise everywhere. Institutions everywhere need at least some autonomy to operate effectively. Students and faculty in most countries share the networked global research system, the Humboldtian norms of freedom to teach and learn, and free research and scholarship, and they need unimpeded cross-border mobility. Most people in higher education, everywhere, if they have a choice, want open systems, they want open communications and sharing, and they want balanced forms of two-way internationalisation so that the strong countries are affected by the others as well as vice versa. So, that's the contributions of higher education, a challenge for researchers, a challenge for all of us, a challenge which we share to understand the contributions, and a challenge for countries to get them right. The CHE are both national, local, and global regional. The CHE are both individualised and collectively consumed. We need a comprehensive theory, we need better metrics, and we need you to contribute to both of those. And we need to understand the CHE through different lenses according to the part of the world that we're in. The social spheres in America, Western Europe, China, Russia, Japan are different, are distinctive, and this shapes the logic of CHE, which is partly national and local and partly global. Using a high capitalist version of the American model, focusing only on individual pecuniary returns at the expense of other contributions, downplays collective goods and worsens social inequality. Centering all expectations on the state is equally futile. The middle path is the right path. Russia needs to define CHE in terms of its own society, its own economy, and its own political system. At the same time, there are also common global goods that Russia shares with all other countries in higher education. Спасибо большое.